The old pickup truck rattled to a stop at the base of Miller's Ridge, dust swirling around its worn tires as 72-year-old Vernon Hackett stepped onto the rocky ground. His weathered hands gripped a hand-drawn map, creased and stained from years of being folded in his shirt pocket. The neighbors in the valley below had watched him make this journey every morning for 3 weeks, hauling timber, tools, and supplies up the mountainside on his back. They whispered among themselves, shaking their heads at what they called foolishness. Building something up there, they said, in a cave, of all places. Winter's coming, and that old man's lost his mind. But Vernon hadn't lost anything except his patience for modern convenience. When the bank foreclosed on his family homestead after 60 years, when his children insisted he move into one of those sterile assisted living facilities with fluorescent lights and scheduled mealtimes, something inside him refused. His grandfather had been a mountain man, living off the land with nothing but an axe and determination. His father had built their family home with timber he'd felled himself, every beam and board shaped by hand. Vernon wasn't about to spend his final years in a place where someone else controlled the thermostat. If you're watching this because you believe there's still value in the old ways, in building with your own 2 hands and living on your own terms, then subscribe to this channel. What you're about to witness isn't just a construction project. It's a testament to what human determination can achieve when we strip away the excuses and get back to basics. Hit that subscribe button because Vernon's story is one you won't forget. 3 months earlier, Vernon had hiked these mountains looking for something the modern world couldn't provide: freedom. He'd discovered the cave by accident, following a deer trail that wound through thick stands of pine and birch. The entrance was partially hidden by overgrown brush, a dark mouth in the mountainside that seemed to breathe cool air even in the summer heat. When he'd stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the darkness, he'd found something remarkable. The cave stretched back nearly 80 feet, with a cathedral ceiling that rose 20 feet at its highest point. The floor was relatively level, covered in centuries of accumulated dust and small rocks. And most importantly, it was dry. No seepage, no underground springs, just solid stone that had withstood millennia of weather. Standing in that cave, Vernon had known immediately what he would do. This would be his home. Not the cave itself, raw and cold, but something built within it. A proper cabin, constructed the way his ancestors would have done it, using the cave as a natural shelter and fortress against the elements. The neighbors could laugh all they wanted. They'd change their tune when winter arrived. The first challenge was access. The cave sat nearly 1,000 feet above the valley floor, accessible only by a narrow game trail that switchbacked through dense forest. Vernon couldn't afford machinery, wouldn't have wanted it even if he could. His pension check barely covered his truck payment and the few supplies he needed. Everything else would have to come from the mountain itself and the strength in his aging but still capable body. He began by widening the trail, using a mattock and shovel he'd owned for 40 years. Every morning before the sun rose too high and the heat became unbearable, Vernon would climb that trail and work. He removed loose rocks, cut back aggressive roots, and created a path just wide enough to drag timber. It took him 2 weeks of steady work, but when he was finished, he could haul an 8-foot log up the mountainside, slowly but surely. The neighbors watched through binoculars. Martha Henderson told her husband that Vernon would kill himself with this nonsense. Frank Morrison bet $20 at the general store that the old man would give up before autumn. Only young Sarah Chen, who'd moved to the valley to escape the chaos of city life, seemed to understand. She'd see Vernon's truck parked at the base of the trail each morning and feel a strange admiration for whatever drove him up that mountain. Vernon's timber came from fallen trees, storm-damaged specimens that had come down in the violent spring storms. He refused to cut a living tree, following the old mountain code his grandfather had taught him. Take what the mountain offers freely, his grandfather would say, and the mountain will provide. It was slow work, finding suitable logs, trimming them with his bow saw, dragging them up the trail. Each log was a day's work, sometimes 2 days, if the wood was particularly heavy or if his joints ached more than usual. But Vernon had something most people had lost: patience born from understanding that worthwhile things take time. He'd spent 40 years as a carpenter before his retirement, had built homes and barns and furniture that would outlast everyone who'd commissioned them. He knew wood like some people knew computers, could read the grain and understand its strength and character. Every log he selected was chosen with purpose, every cut made with consideration for how it would fit into the larger structure. By the end of the first month, Vernon had accumulated 32 logs of various lengths, all stacked near the cave entrance. The neighbors assumed he was gathering firewood for the winter, preparing to hole up in some desperate survival situation. They still didn't understand what he was actually planning. The cave's interior required preparation. Vernon spent a week clearing the floor, removing centuries of debris, small rocks, and accumulated organic matter. He worked methodically, section by section, using a shovel and wheelbarrow he'd hauled up in pieces. The wheelbarrow trips back down the mountain to dump the debris were exhausting but necessary. He needed a level, clean foundation for what he was about to build. When the floor was finally clear, Vernon used a primitive but effective method to level it further. He'd learned this technique from a book about frontier construction. Using sand and smaller stones from the mountainside, he created a base layer, compacting it by walking over it repeatedly, adding material where needed, removing it where there was excess. It took another week, but when he was finished, he had a relatively flat surface, measuring approximately 30 feet by 20 feet. This would be his building space. Now came the decision that would define everything: the cabin's design. Vernon sat at the cave entrance for an entire day, sketching on a piece of birch bark with a pencil worn down to a nub. He couldn't build too large, or he'd run out of materials and strength. Too small, and he'd feel trapped during the long winter months. He needed space for sleeping, cooking, storage, and most importantly, a workspace where he could continue his wood carving, the hobby that had kept his hands busy and his mind sharp through retirement. He settled on a design that would utilize the cave's natural features. The cabin would be 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a sloped roof that would funnel any moisture that somehow entered the cave toward the entrance and away from his living space. One wall would be shared with the cave's stone surface, reducing his material needs. The front wall would have a door and a small window, though that window would look into the darkness of the cave rather than the outside world. For ventilation, he'd create a clever system using the cave's natural air currents. The foundation came next. Vernon gathered flat stones from a nearby stream bed, carrying them up the mountain in a canvas bag that had belonged to his father. These stones would serve as pier foundations, keeping his cabin floor off the cave floor, preventing moisture and cold from seeping up through the wood. He arranged them in a grid pattern, checking their level with a simple tool he'd made from a straight piece of wood, a string, and a stone weight. This part of the work was punishing on his knees and back. He was 72, not 22, and his body reminded him of this fact with every bend and lift. But Vernon had learned long ago that pain was temporary, while quitting lasted forever. He worked in shorter shifts, rested more frequently, and listened to his body without letting it dictate his decisions. If you're still watching, if Vernon's determination is inspiring you to tackle your own impossible project, leave a comment below telling us what you're building or creating. This community is built on people who refuse to accept limitations, who understand that the most meaningful achievements come from perseverance. Drop a comment and let us know you're part of this journey. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. With the foundation stones in place, Vernon began the actual construction. He'd decided to use a traditional notched log technique, similar to what frontier settlers had employed. Each log would be notched at the ends to interlock with perpendicular logs, creating a sturdy, self-supporting structure. This method required no nails or screws, which was fortunate since Vernon had neither in sufficient quantity. The first log went down on the foundation stones, running along what would be the back wall adjacent to the cave stone. Vernon had chosen one of his straightest, heaviest logs for this, knowing it would bear significant weight. He used wooden wedges to shim it perfectly level, checking and rechecking with his homemade level tool. This first log was critical. Any error here would compound through every subsequent layer. The second log ran perpendicular, forming the beginning of the side wall. This was where the notching came in. Vernon had brought several tools for this work: a small chainsaw he'd owned for 20 years that still ran despite its age, though he used it sparingly to conserve the limited fuel he'd hauled up. A handsaw, a chisel set his father had given him on his 16th birthday, and a wooden mallet he'd carved himself decades ago. Notching each log was an art form. Too deep, and the structure would have gaps that let in cold air. Too shallow, and the logs wouldn't seat properly, creating instability. Vernon cut each notch carefully, testing the fit. Adjusting, testing again. In modern construction, this process would take minutes with power tools and templates. Vernon took hours per notch, but the result was perfection. Each log seated into the next with a satisfying solidity, locked in place by nothing more than clever geometry and gravity. The work was meditation. As his hands moved through the familiar motions of measuring, marking, cutting, and fitting, Vernon's mind wandered through memories. He thought about his grandfather's stories of building their first mountain cabin, about his father teaching him to read wood grain, about his own children who'd left the valley for cities and careers that made sense to everyone but him. He didn't resent their choices, but he also didn't share their values. They lived in a world of climate control and delivered meals, of screens and scheduled entertainment. Vernon lived in a world of sweat and splinters, of creating shelter with his hands, and sleeping soundly from honest exhaustion. The walls rose slowly. 1 log per day was good progress. Sometimes a particularly difficult piece might take 2 days to prepare and fit. Vernon developed a routine. Wake before dawn, eat a simple breakfast of oatmeal cooked on a camp stove, climb the trail as the sun rose, work until noon, rest and eat lunch in the cave's cool darkness, work until the light began to fail, climb back down, sleep hard in his truck bed, repeat. The neighbors continued to watch, some with concern, others with amusement, a few with grudging respect. Frank Morrison lost his $20 bet when September arrived, and Vernon showed no signs of quitting. The walls of his cabin were now 4 feet high, clearly visible to anyone who hiked close enough to peer into the cave entrance. At the 6-foot height, Vernon faced a new challenge. The logs were becoming difficult to lift into place alone. Each one weighed between 60 and 90 pounds, and hoisting them overhead to seat them in their notches was testing his strength. He solved this problem the way his ancestors would have, with a simple lever and fulcrum system. Using a long, strong branch as a lever and a carefully placed rock as a fulcrum, he could raise one end of a log, prop it with a temporary support, then move to the other end and repeat the process until the log was high enough to slide into place. It was slow, it was difficult, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. Modern builders would have used cranes and crews. Vernon had himself, basic physics, and determination that bordered on stubbornness. By October, the walls stood 8 feet high. Vernon had decided this would be sufficient height for his cabin, providing enough vertical space without requiring impossibly difficult lifts for the final logs. Now came one of the most critical phases, the roof structure. He'd been planning this since the beginning, saving his longest and straightest logs for this purpose. The roof would be a simple sloped design, higher at the front and lower at the back, allowing any moisture to run off. The slope would be gentle, as there was no rain inside the cave, but it needed enough pitch to prevent cold air from pooling at the ceiling. Vernon began by placing 2 ridge beams across the width of the cabin, resting them on the front and back walls. These beams would carry the weight of the roof structure. He'd selected 2 perfectly matched logs for this, both dead straight pine that had fallen in the same storm. They went up using his lever system, a process that took an entire day and left his muscles trembling with exhaustion. The roof rafters came next, smaller diameter logs placed perpendicular to the ridge beams at 2-foot intervals. Vernon notched these into the ridge beams, creating a secure connection. Each rafter had to be precisely measured and cut, as any variation would show in the finished roof. He worked slowly, methodically, checking and rechecking his measurements using a homemade measuring stick he'd marked with precise increments. Winter was approaching. Vernon could feel it in the morning air, see it in the changing leaves of the valley far below. He had perhaps 3 more weeks before the first serious cold arrived, maybe 4, if he was lucky. The roof needed to be finished and sealed. The door needed to be hung. The interior needed basic finishing. It was a race against weather and his own aging body. But Vernon didn't panic. Panic was for people who hadn't planned properly. He'd known from the beginning that this would come down to timing, and he'd built that consideration into every decision. The cabin was deliberately modest in size. His material selection had prioritized availability over perfection. His design eliminated unnecessary complexity. Everything had been calculated to be just barely achievable by one old man with basic tools and limited time. The roof rafters were complete by mid-October, and Vernon moved to the next critical phase, covering them. In modern construction, this would mean plywood sheets and shingles. Vernon had neither, and even if he'd had the money to buy such materials, getting them up the mountain would have been impossible. Instead, he turned to a method that predated industrial lumber by centuries. He spent 2 days collecting bark from fallen birch trees. Birch bark, when harvested from dead trees, came off in large, flexible sheets that were naturally water-resistant. His grandfather had told him stories of Native American dwellings covered entirely in birch bark, shelters that kept their inhabitants dry through torrential storms. Vernon peeled these sheets carefully, keeping them as large as possible, then hauled them up the mountain in rolled bundles tied with rope. The installation was tedious work that tested his patience. Each piece of bark had to be laid in an overlapping pattern, like scales on a fish, starting from the bottom edge of the roof and working upward. This ensured that water, if any somehow entered the cave, would run down and off rather than seeping between the layers. Vernon used small wooden pegs he'd whittled to secure the bark to the rafters, drilling pilot holes with a hand drill to prevent splitting. The neighbors thought he'd finally gone completely mad when Sarah Chen hiked up one afternoon and found him methodically covering a wooden structure with tree bark inside a dark cave. But she didn't laugh. Instead, she asked questions, genuinely curious about his techniques. Vernon, who'd grown accustomed to working in solitude, found himself explaining the logic behind each choice. The cave protected from rain and snow, but temperature and moisture could still be issues. The bark provided insulation. The elevated floor prevented ground cold from rising. The sloped roof channeled any condensation away from his living space. Sarah returned to the valley and reported what she'd seen. The mockery quieted somewhat. What Vernon was building wasn't crazy. It was ingenious. A cabin sheltered within stone, protected from the worst of winter's fury, built entirely by hand, using materials the mountain provided. Even Frank Morrison admitted grudgingly that the old man might actually survive up there. With the roof complete, Vernon constructed his door from split logs he'd been saving. He used wooden pegs and natural fiber rope to bind the pieces together, creating a solid panel that hung on leather hinges he'd fashioned from an old belt. The door fit snugly into its frame, and Vernon carved a simple wooden latch that could be operated from inside or outside. The window was smaller, just 2 feet square, positioned to allow him to see toward the cave entrance when light filtered in during the day. He covered it with a frame over which he'd stretched an oiled cloth, translucent enough to let light pass, but thick enough to provide privacy and insulation. Inside, Vernon built essential furniture using techniques that required no metal fasteners. A bed frame from split logs, a table, 2 chairs, shelves along one wall for food storage, and his carving tools. Each piece was functional, sturdy, built to last. He constructed a small cooking area with stones arranged to contain fire, with a chimney he'd ingeniously created using the cave's natural draft. A vertical shaft of stacked stones that directed smoke toward a natural fissure in the cave ceiling that led outside. November arrived with the first serious cold snap. Vernon spent his final days before winter sealed him in gathering firewood, stacking it along the cave wall near his cabin. He'd collected dried wood all season, knowing he'd need substantial fuel to keep warm. He also stockpiled food, dried beans, rice, flour, salt, a few precious jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat he'd prepared himself. He had a hand-operated grain mill for making flour, a cast-iron pot for cooking, basic tools for maintenance and repair. The day the first snow fell, Vernon stood at the cave entrance and watched it blanket the valley below. His truck was already parked at a neighbor's place for winter storage. He had no way down the mountain now, and no reason to go. Everything he needed was here, in this cabin he'd built with his own hands inside a mountain. The neighbors wondered if they'd ever see him again. But Vernon wasn't worried. He'd prepared properly, built solidly, and chosen his shelter wisely. Inside his cave cabin, with a fire crackling in his stone hearth and wind howling outside the mountain, Vernon carved small wooden figures by lamplight and felt more at home than he'd been in years. Winter could come. He was ready. When the worst blizzard in 20 years hit in December, burying the valley under 4 feet of snow, the neighbors finally understood why Vernon had built where he did. While they struggled with frozen pipes and power outages, Vernon sat warm and dry in his mountain sanctuary, the cave protecting his cabin from the worst of the storm's fury, just as he'd known it would. December's blizzard lasted 5 days, transforming the valley into an Arctic wasteland that brought modern life to a grinding halt. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice. Roads became impassable. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero, and the wind screamed through the valley with such ferocity that it tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows in homes that had stood for generations. Emergency services struggled to reach isolated families. The general store ran out of supplies. People who'd lived their entire lives in the valley admitted they'd never seen weather this brutal. Vernon barely noticed. Inside his cave, the temperature remained a steady 42 degrees, the stone walls providing thermal mass that resisted the extreme cold outside. Inside his cabin within the cave, his small fire kept the enclosed space comfortable at 65 degrees. He burned far less wood than he'd anticipated, the double-layer protection of cabin and cave creating an efficiency that modern insulation could barely match. He ate hot meals, slept soundly under wool blankets he'd owned for 30 years, and spent his days carving intricate patterns into pieces of maple and birch. The storm's howling was distant, muffled by thousands of tons of stone. Occasionally, Vernon would walk to the cave entrance and look out at the wall of white that obscured everything beyond 50 feet. Then he'd return to his cabin, add a log to his fire, and continue his quiet work. He felt no anxiety, no fear, no doubt about his choices. This was exactly what he'd built for, exactly what he'd prepared for. On the 6th day, the storm broke. Sunlight returned, harsh and brilliant against the fresh snow. The valley emerged into an eerie silence, the kind that only follows truly devastating weather. Vernon walked down to the cave entrance and surveyed what he could see of the landscape. The world had been remade in white, every familiar landmark transformed or hidden entirely. It was Sarah Chen who organized the wellness check. She convinced Frank Morrison and 2 other men to help her make the climb up Miller's Ridge with snowshoes and supplies. They were certain they'd find Vernon's body, frozen in some desperate attempt to survive. The climb took them 4 hours through waist-deep snow, following the barely discernible path Vernon had created months earlier. When they reached the cave entrance, exhausted and half-frozen themselves despite their modern gear, they found Vernon sitting on a log bench he'd positioned just inside the opening, carving a wooden spoon and humming an old folk song his grandfather had taught him. He looked up as they approached, showing no surprise at their arrival. "Figured someone would come checking eventually," Vernon said, setting down his carving. "Appreciate the concern, but as you can see, I'm doing just fine." Sarah stared past him into the cave, where the outline of his cabin was visible in the dim light. Smoke rose from his chimney system, and through the small window, they could see the warm glow of lamplight. The contrast between the frozen hell they'd just climbed through and this scene of comfortable domesticity was almost surreal. "You really did it," Frank Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. "We thought you'd lost your mind, Vernon, but you knew exactly what you were doing." Vernon invited them inside, and the 4 visitors crowded into his small cabin, grateful for the warmth. He served them hot coffee made from grounds he'd been carefully rationing, and they sat around his handmade table while he explained his systems in detail. The ventilation that drew fresh air through the cave while venting smoke. The water collection method he'd devised using cave condensation and melted snow. The food storage that stayed cool but never froze. The bed that was comfortable despite being nothing but wood and rope with a straw-filled mattress. "How much wood are you burning?" Sarah asked, doing mental calculations about whether his supply would last the winter. About 4 logs a day, Vernon replied. I've got enough stacked to last until April, maybe longer if I'm careful. The cave does most of the work keeping the cold out. The cabin just needs to take the edge off. The visitors stayed for an hour, warming themselves before facing the brutal journey back down. Before they left, Frank Morrison extended his hand to Vernon. I owe you an apology. I bet against you, old man. Said you'd never make it. I've never been happier to lose money. Vernon shook his hand. No apology needed. I knew what people were thinking. Can't blame folks for doubting when they've never seen something like this done before. After they left, word spread through the valley about what Vernon had accomplished. The mockery transformed into admiration, then into something more profound. Here was a man who'd rejected the modern world's solutions and created his own, using methods that were centuries old but perfectly suited to his needs. He wasn't surviving up there, he was thriving, comfortable and self-sufficient while the valley below struggled with the aftermath of the storm. Young people started asking questions. How had he learned these skills? Where did the knowledge come from? Could they learn to build this way? Vernon became an unlikely symbol of something many had thought was lost: the ability to live independently, to create shelter and warmth and comfort without depending on systems that could fail when truly tested. January brought more storms, though none as severe as December's blizzard. Vernon fell into a rhythm that felt ancient and right. He woke with the pale light that filtered into the cave at dawn. He maintained his fire, cooked simple meals, spent hours carving and crafting small items he planned to give as gifts when spring returned. He read books by lamplight, classics he'd owned for years but never had time to properly enjoy. He thought deeply about his life, about the choices that had led him to this cave, about what it meant to live deliberately. The isolation that would have driven most people mad felt like a gift to Vernon. He'd spent 72 years in a world that never stopped talking, never stopped demanding attention, never stopped moving. Here, finally, was silence. Here was time to think, to create, to simply exist without constant stimulation or distraction. February tested him differently. Not with weather, but with the psychological weight of prolonged solitude. There were days when the silence felt oppressive, when he craved conversation, when memories of his children and grandchildren created an ache in his chest. These were the moments when doubt crept in, when he questioned whether this independence was worth the loneliness. But Vernon had learned long ago that difficult emotions, like difficult weather, simply had to be endured. He worked through the lonely days by focusing on projects. He repaired small issues in his cabin that he'd noticed. He organized his supplies, he planned improvements for spring, and slowly the melancholy would pass, replaced by contentment with his simple life. Sarah Chen visited twice more during the winter, bringing news from the valley and supplies Vernon hadn't asked for but appreciated. Batteries for his lamp, coffee, a book she thought he'd enjoy. She never stayed long, understanding that Vernon's solitude was chosen and precious, but her visits created a connection to the world below that Vernon found he needed, even if only occasionally. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. Icicles formed at the cave entrance during the day and refroze at night. The sun climbed higher, stayed longer, carried more warmth. Vernon began venturing outside the cave on clear days, walking the ridge, observing the slow transformation as winter released its grip. His cabin had performed flawlessly. Not one log had shifted. The roof had kept him dry. The door had never frozen shut. His heating system had proven more efficient than he'd calculated. He'd used less than half his firewood supply, leaving him with a surplus for next winter. His food stores were adequate, though he was thoroughly tired of beans and rice and looked forward to fresh vegetables come spring. What Vernon had proven to himself and to everyone watching from below was that the old ways weren't inferior to modern methods. They were simply different, with their own strengths and advantages. His cave cabin required no electricity, no plumbing, no connection to systems that could fail. It demanded only his own effort and knowledge, and in return it provided security and shelter that had withstood the worst winter in memory. As April brought genuine warmth and the snow began its final retreat, Vernon stood at his cave entrance one morning and watched the valley emerge from its white blanket. Green was returning to the world. Birds were returning to the mountain. Life was reasserting itself after winter's pause. He thought about his children, working in their offices in distant cities, living in climate-controlled apartments where they never felt truly cold or truly hot, where their food came from stores and their shelter was maintained by others. He didn't judge them for their choices, but he also knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice for himself. Vernon had built more than a cabin in this cave. He'd built proof that a man could still carve out independence in a world that insisted independence was impossible. He'd built a home that asked nothing from the modern world and gave him everything he needed. He'd built a testament to skills and knowledge that many had written off as obsolete. When Sarah made her first spring visit in late April, bringing fresh eggs and vegetables from the valley, she found Vernon outside his cave, planting a small garden in a sunny spot he'd identified. He'd carried soil up the mountain in bags, was starting seeds in wooden boxes he'd constructed, planning a summer of fresh food to supplement his stores. "You're really planning to stay, aren't you?" she asked, watching him work. "This isn't just a winter experiment, this is permanent." Vernon straightened, his back protesting the movement, and looked out over the valley greening below. "This is home now. Built it myself, proved it works, and I've got no reason to leave. Figure I've got a few more good years in these old bones. Plan to spend them right here, living the way my grandfather would have understood." And that's exactly what he did. Vernon Hackett became a fixture on Miller's Ridge, the old man in the cave who'd rejected modernity and created his own version of the good life. People hiked up to visit him, to learn from him, to understand how he'd done what he'd done. He welcomed them, shared his knowledge freely, but never encouraged anyone to follow his exact path. This was his answer to life's questions, he'd explain. Everyone had to find their own. The cabin in the cave stood as proof that determination, skill, and respect for old wisdom could create something remarkable. It stood as a challenge to the assumption that comfort required complexity, that security required dependence on systems beyond our control. And it stood as Vernon's final statement, that a life built with your own hands, lived on your own terms, was worth any amount of hardship or sacrifice.